I remember the exact moment my life became a headline. Not metaphorically, literally. A photo taken from across the street by someone I never saw, published at 11 on a Thursday night, shared 40,000 times before I woke up the next morning. In the photo, I'm leaving Marcus's apartment carrying a cardboard box and a coat that wasn't mine, because mine was inside, and I couldn't go back for it. My expression isn't sadness. It's the face of someone who hasn't yet understood what's happening. The kind of face people capture and caption with things like, "end of an era," and "we saw this coming." My name is Alara Voss. I'm 32 years old. I'm an investigative reporter at the Chicago Chronicle. Or I was before the Chronicle became the place where people looked at me with that specific mixture of pity and curiosity that's almost impossible to endure without falling apart. Marcus Calloway is editor-in-chief at the Tribune. We were together for 2 years. The relationship ended the way things only end when two very intelligent, very proud, very public people decide they no longer know how to be kind to each other. It wasn't dramatic. It was slow. It was surgical. And then it was photographed. The Chicago that woke up that Friday knew about the breakup before I did. I spent the next 3 days in my friend Dana's apartment, drinking tea that went cold before I remembered to drink it, reading articles about myself as though they were about a stranger, trying to understand how a private life could become public content with such efficiency. My editors were kind. My colleagues were, in their way, kind too. The kind of kindness that comes with a step sideways, a caution, as if the scandal were contagious. What no one told me, and what I should have anticipated, is that journalists who become news lose something that has no precise name but carries enormous weight. You lose the authority of anonymity. You begin to exist in the same space as your sources. And when your sources know you as a character rather than a professional, doors close differently, more quietly, more permanently. In the second week, my editor called me in for a conversation he described as strategic, the kind I immediately recognized as the sort where someone tells you something impossible very gently. He said there was pressure from above. Said the visibility of my breakup was creating an image conflict for the paper, since Marcus and the Chronicle had a delicate institutional relationship. Said I deserved time to regroup. Said he'd hold my position for 30 days. 30 days. I left the Chronicle with my press badge around my neck and nowhere to go. It was that afternoon, specifically that afternoon, that Dominique Voss's assistant called me. I knew Dominique Voss the way all of Chicago knew her. By reputation, by headlines, by that specific quality of presence some people have that makes their name take up space, even when they're not in the room. Dominique Voss was 45. She founded Voss Capital at 30, transformed it into one of the 3 largest private equity firms in the Midwest, and had built a reputation on 2 things that rarely coexist with such force: clinical intelligence and an absolute, almost irrational loyalty toward the people she chose to protect. She had never given a personal interview. She spoke only through spokespeople. She had no social media. I had interviewed her once, 18 months earlier, about a merger involving a public health company. The interview lasted 32 minutes. She answered every question with the precision of someone who has the habit of thinking 3 times before speaking and never regrets what she said. At the end, she looked at me with those eyes, a gray that shifted with the light, and said, "You ask better questions than most." It wasn't a compliment. It was an observation. We'd had no contact since. The assistant said Dr. Voss would like to have dinner with me that week. No brief, no declared agenda. I said yes because I had nothing better to do, and because, honestly, curiosity is my strongest reflex. The restaurant was Italian, in the West Loop, the kind of place that needs no sign on the facade, because the people who go there already know where it is. Her table was in the back, against a brick wall, private without being hidden. She was already there when I arrived. Standing, not sitting, which was already a choice that communicated something it took me a moment to decode. She wasn't waiting. She was present. Dominique Voss was tall, dark hair cut with precision, Clothes that were expensive without announcing that they were expensive. The same woman from the interview 18 months earlier, except she was looking at me slightly differently now. No longer the way a source evaluates a reporter. Another way. Slower. "Good evening," she said. "Good evening," I replied. We sat. She ordered wine without consulting the menu. She ordered real food, which for some reason surprised me, as if people with that level of power existed without needing to eat. We talked for 40 minutes about things that weren't the reason I was there. About Chicago in winter. About a book neither of us had finished. About the difference between ambition and compulsion. And then she stopped. She paused her wine glass in midair, looked at me and said, "I need to propose something to you, and I want you to hear me out before you respond." I listened. She said she knew about the breakup. Said she knew about the pressure at the Chronicle. Said, with a precision that made me understand she had researched this, that my professional position was vulnerable not because I had done anything wrong, but because the personal scandal of a woman in a field like journalism carries a disproportionate cost compared to a man in the same situation. She said she knew that mechanism, that it had cost her something, years earlier, in a way she wouldn't detail, but that I could research if I wanted. And then she said, "I'm offering you my last name." Silence. "A marriage of convenience," she continued, with the same naturalness with which she might describe a business partnership agreement. "Public. Legally sound in every detail. For 12 months. Long enough for the scandal to lose traction, for you to reclaim your position at the Chronicle, or find something better. For the market to see you as someone with a stable life, and not as the character in a sidewalk photo. At the end of the 12 months, a civilized divorce, no drama, no leaks." She paused. "I'm not asking for anything in return," she said. "Only that you be honest with me throughout the process, and that you don't try to understand me more than I want to be understood." I looked at her for a long moment. "Why?" I asked. "Because I can," she said. "And because sometimes the right thing to do is simply to do it." I should have said no. Any sensible person, any journalist with a minimum of critical distance, would have recognized that situation as impossible to navigate with objectivity, sanity, the kind of emotional clarity that allows you to make decisions without regret. I said yes on a Wednesday evening in a restaurant with no sign on the facade, and I signed a contract the following Monday in her office, in a building with more security in the lobby than most courthouses. The contract was 12 pages. Elegant in language and absolutely cold in substance. It defined what would be public, what would be private, what constituted a breach of agreement, what would happen at the end of the 12 months. I read every page 3 times. She waited without rushing me. When I finished, she handed me a pen and said, "Don't sign if you have any doubts." I signed. What no one tells you about marrying someone for convenience is that cohabitation is not convenient. In the first days, Voss Capital issued a brief statement about the relationship. The media picked it up. The narrative that emerged was, for the most part, favorable. The investigative reporter and the private equity CEO, 2 women with powerful careers, a discreet relationship that had been formalized away from the spotlight. There were inevitably those who speculated, who questioned the timing, who connected the dots in ways that approached the truth. But the dominant narrative was something else. And dominant narrative, I knew better than anyone, is what matters, in the short term. I moved into her apartment. It was in a high-rise in the Gold Coast, 17th floor, and had that specific quality of spaces, decorated by someone who understands aesthetics but inhabits them in a very organized, very contained way. No clutter, no items out of place. Books on the shelves in an order that wasn't alphabetical, but had a logic I spent the first 3 days trying to decode. Art on the walls that wasn't decorative, it was chosen. A kitchen that looked used, which surprised me. She cooked at night, sometimes, when she arrived late from the office. Not elaborate things. Eggs, rice, a soup she made with ingredients I couldn't identify, but that smelled of cilantro and something darker. I learned not to offer help, because she always declined. Not rudely, but with a firmness that communicated that moment was hers. I learned to sit on the kitchen stool and read, or work, in her silent proximity while she cooked, and that this was accepted in a way that offering a hand was not. Sometimes she talked. Not much. Observations about the day, a question about something she'd seen in my work, because she read everything I published, which I discovered by accident when she referenced a paragraph from a profile I'd written 2 years earlier. "You read that?" I said. "I did," she said without elaborating. On the third Sunday, there was a crisis at Voss Capital. I didn't learn the full details until much later. But that afternoon, she spent 4 hours in the home office with the door closed, and when she came out, her face carried that specific containment of someone who had spent considerable time being who they needed to be and was reaching their limit. She went to the kitchen, started making the soup. And I, who was in the living room and could see the kitchen through the opening, made a choice I still can't fully explain. I got up, went to the kitchen, sat on the stool without saying anything. She didn't say anything either. We stayed like that for 40 minutes while she cooked, and I simply sat there. And it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the opposite. It was one of those silences with a different texture from other silences. And when she placed 2 plates on the counter and sat on the other side, without remarking that she had made enough for 2 people, I understood that something had shifted at a level the 12-page contract had not anticipated. At work, things changed the way she had predicted they would. My editor called in the 3rd week, said the pressure had eased, said my position was secure, said it in a way that made me understand the last name had done what she had said it would do. It had created a different context, a different narrative, a different Alara in public perception. I should have felt only relief. I felt relief. But there was also something else that didn't have a name yet. I began working on a profile that hadn't been planned. Not about Dominique, about the private equity sector, about the mechanisms by which capital moves through healthcare and public education in Chicago, about who decides what and why. It was the kind of investigation I'd wanted to pursue for 2 years and had never found the right angle to enter. And now, by an irony I hadn't planned, I was married to one of the most informed people about those mechanisms in the city. This wasn't what the contract had anticipated, but it wasn't exactly what I was doing either. I wasn't using access. I was simply thinking differently, in a different space, with a different perspective. At least that's what I told myself for a few weeks. It was on a November night, when Chicago was in that specific state of cold that isn't yet snow, but is no longer autumn, that she arrived late and different. Not obviously different. Different in the way I had learned to recognize in her. Subtle, involving her shoulders and the way she set things on the counter. Something had happened. Not a crisis this time. Something quieter and heavier. She went straight to the living room, stood at the window for a time I didn't clock, but that was long. I was on the sofa with my laptop and didn't pretend not to be paying attention, because with her, pretending didn't work. She always knew. "What happened?" I said. She took a while to respond. When she did, she didn't turn from the window. "I lost a client today. Not financially. I declined to renew a contract. It was the kind of company I shouldn't have taken on in the first place, and I took too long to correct it." "How much?" I asked. She turned. Looked at me with that expression that meant she was evaluating how much I was asking for journalistic reasons and how much I was asking for another reason. "Enough to matter," she said. "Not enough to make me change my mind." Silence. "Why did you tell me this?" I said. "Because you would have found out anyway," she said. "Either I tell you, or you find it in a public document. And I'd rather it come from me." I looked at her. She looked back at me. And in that moment, there was an honesty the contract hadn't created, and that neither of us had planned. "This isn't because of the contract," I said. telling me this. No, she said. It isn't. There was a gala at Voss Capital in December. An annual event, 400 guests, the kind of evening where Chicago displayed itself in a veneer I knew well enough to see through. It was the first significant public appearance we would make together. I had bought a dress on my own, black, without consulting anyone. And she had looked at me when I came out of the bedroom and said perfect, without elaborating, and I realized I had filed that word away the way you file words that arrive when you weren't expecting them. The evening was what galas are, simultaneously beautiful and exhausting. I circulated. She circulated. We found each other and parted with that natural choreography two people develop when they've spent enough time in the same space. And at some point in the later part of the evening, when the crowd had thinned and Chicago glittered outside the windows, she appeared beside me at a second-floor balcony where I had retreated for a moment of quiet. She stood there, arms not crossed, which I had learned to recognize as the opposite of her default. She looked out at the city. "You're doing well," she said. Not as a question. "I'm tired of performing," I said. She turned her face toward me. There was something in her eyes in that light I can't describe precisely, except to say it was the first time I had seen Dominique Voss without the layer of containment she maintained with the rest of the world. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. It was almost frightening to witness because it was so real. "So am I," she said, and we stood there, shoulder almost touching shoulder, looking out at the city for a time neither of us measured. It was in the 5th week of January that I found the document. I was working on the investigation, at home, in the office she had offered me without my asking because she had noticed I needed a separate space to think. I was searching public records about capital movement in healthcare sectors in Illinois, and in a municipal transparency file that had been published 3 years earlier and had never received enough attention, I found something. It was a series of transactions. Complex. Linking a network of investment funds to a conglomerate of low-income clinics in Chicago that had closed over the past 2 years, leaving 16 neighborhoods without primary medical coverage. The mechanism was elegant, and it was wrong. And one of the funds in the chain had a name I recognized. I spent 3 hours verifying, spent 2 more hours telling myself I had verified incorrectly, spent an hour telling myself there was a reasonable explanation. And then I stopped lying to myself. That evening, when she arrived, I was sitting in the kitchen with my laptop closed in front of me. She read me immediately, set her bag on the counter, stood still. "What is it?" she said. I looked at her, pushed the laptop aside. "I need to show you something, and I need you to be honest with me," I said, not as a wife, as a source. Something passed across her face. It took 2 seconds. "Show me," she said. I opened the laptop, turned it toward her. She leaned in, read in silence, read again. Was quiet for a time that was very long. "Dominique," I said. "I know," she said. "You knew," I said, not asking. "Not the way you're thinking," she said. But I knew enough, and I didn't ask enough questions. Because not asking the right question is a choice, and I made that choice. The silence that followed was different from all the silences before it. It had edges. "What are you going to do?" she said. "Publish," I said. She nodded. Once, slowly. "I need you to know this will create significant problems," she said. "For me, for the firm, for the narrative we've built." "I know," I said. "And you're going to publish anyway." "Yes." She looked at me for a long moment with those eyes I had learned to read, but which in that moment were harder to decipher than at any other time. "All right," she said. "Then what do you need from me?" The air left my lungs in a way I hadn't expected. "You're not going to try to stop me," I said. "You're a journalist," she said simply. "That's the work, but it's about you." "Partially," she said. And I was wrong. Not in the most direct way possible, but wrong enough to matter. You shouldn't protect that because of the contract, and I wouldn't expect you to. Pause. "But Alara?" she said. and there was something in the way she said my name that was different from every other time. I looked at her. "When this publishes," she said slowly, "the contract will become a problem. People will use the marriage to question your impartiality. You know that." "I know," I said. "Then we need to think about how to protect the work," she said. "Not me. The work." I kept looking at her. "You're helping me publish something that will complicate your life," I said. "I'm helping you do what's right," she said. "Those are different things." The profile was published on a Monday in February. 4 pages in the Chronicle, with complete documentation and 3 additional sources I had developed over months of investigation. Dominique Voss is mentioned in the 3rd paragraph as one of the managers with indirect exposure to the scheme. The Voss capital statement was issued that afternoon. Acknowledgement of the exposure, commitment to internal investigation, cooperation with authorities. Clean, precise. Written by someone who had learned that the best defense is the truth told before it's told by others. Chicago reacted the way Chicago reacts to financial scandals involving public health, with anger and with attention. And then came the other part. The comments started that same day. The narrative some chose was predictable. The reporter married to the investigated CEO, the obvious conflict of interest, the manipulation on one side or the other. My credibility was questioned. Her motivations were questioned. The marriage, of course, was dissected with a relish that can only be described as voracious. I expected this. But expecting something and living it are different experiences. I spent that evening at the Chronicle answering a series of emails that were angry or questioning or both at once, and when I got back to the apartment, it was almost midnight. She was awake, in the living room, with a glass of water and no lights on except the glow of the city through the windows. I sat on the sofa across from her, said nothing for a moment. "You were waiting for me," I said. She didn't deny it. "I'm fine," I said. "I know," she said. We sat in silence for a time that was long but not heavy. "Ilara," she said. I looked up. "The contract ends in April," she said. 2 months. "I know," I said. "I want you to know," she said slowly, choosing each word with that precision so characteristically hers, that whatever you decide about April, I won't use what happened between us to try to influence that decision. That's yours. Completely. Between us, I said. She paused. That phrase had slipped out, and we both knew it had slipped. "Within the contract," she corrected calmly. But it had hung in the air, and she knew it had. I looked at her in the dark living room with Chicago lit up behind her, and thought about all the evenings of shared silence, and all the soup made for 2 people without anyone mentioning it, and all the moments in which I had learned to read her shoulders like a language, and the way she had said the work, not me, when what she was protecting was clearly not only the work. I got up from the sofa. She followed me with her eyes without moving. I walked to where she was, sat beside her, closer than anything in the contract had anticipated, and for a moment neither of us said anything. "Dominique," I said. She was looking at me. "You know I'm an investigative reporter," I said. "I know," she said, cautious. "Then you should know I'm very bad at not noticing things," I said, even when I tried. She was quiet. "I noticed," I said. "From the 3rd Sunday. The soup for 2 people. I noticed." She looked down, then at the city, then back at me. "It wasn't part of the agreement," she said. "It wasn't planned." "I know," I said. "That's why it matters." There was an expression on her face I had only seen once before, on that balcony at the December gala, that absence of containment which was rare enough to be impossible to ignore. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "I have no reference point for what comes after a contract that was honest, but also insufficient to cover what actually happened." "Neither do I," said. "You're not afraid of that," she said. not as an observation, as something close to admiration. "I'm very afraid," I said. "But I'm a journalist. I walk into difficult spaces anyway." She gave a low laugh. The real one. The kind that only lasted a few seconds but changed the temperature of the room. The same one I had stored away the first time I heard it. And then she turned to me with that face I had spent months learning, and that still surprised me, and said, "The agreement ends in April." "I know," I said. "But this," she said, "what's happening here? This doesn't have to end in April." I looked at her for a long moment. "Not as a proposal," she said immediately. "As a question. An honest question, asked by someone who doesn't have the habit of asking questions she doesn't know the answer to." I took a moment. "You protected me with your last name," I said. She nodded. "And then you didn't try to stop me, when what I needed to do was going to complicate your life," I said. She nodded again. "And you made soup for 2 people for 4 months, without ever mentioning that you'd made it for 2 people. The corners of her mouth curved slightly. "That's a lot of soup to ignore," she said. I laughed, the kind of laugh that escapes before you decide to allow it. "So when you ask whether this has to end in April," I said, "the answer is no. It doesn't have to. Unless you want it to." She looked at me with those eyes that were a gray that shifted with the light. Eyes I had spent months trying to categorize, and that simply refused to be categorized. "I don't want it to," she said. Simply, without performance. And there, in the dark living room of a 17th floor apartment with Chicago spilling through the windows, that woman who had given me her last name as a calculation and had stayed awake waiting for me to come home as something entirely different from a calculation, placed her hand over mine with a gentleness that didn't match her reputation, but matched everything I had learned about her. And I thought about all the story I had written about her, not in the Chronicle, but in my head, on the nights I lay awake trying to understand why a woman with everything she had would choose to offer what she had offered to someone she barely knew. And I understood, finally, that the question had been wrong from the beginning. She hadn't offered me her last name because she could. She had offered me her last name because she had seen me in that sidewalk photo with the cardboard box and the coat that wasn't mine, and she had recognized something, perhaps the specific loneliness of a woman who is very capable and entirely alone in that moment. And she had made a decision she called a calculation, because it was the only language she knew how to use to cover what it really was. The divorce was filed in April, exactly as the contract stipulated. And the next day I moved back into her apartment, because it was, and had been for months, the place where I thought most clearly. She said nothing when the key turned in the lock. She was in the kitchen. There was soup on the stove. For 2 people. Always for 2 people. If this story touched something in you, if you recognized at any moment the distance between what is said and what is real, between what is contract and what is truth, then you already know why this channel exists. Here we tell love stories between women. Stories that begin where no one expected and end where no one planned. If you stayed until the end, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments. Would you have signed that contract? I want to know. Until the next story.